I turned around and there was a young man there sitting about 2 feet away from me, pointing a shotgun at me.
The Profile. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio. Where faith comes to life.
Hello and welcome to The Profile, here on Premier Christian Radio. I'm Rachel Matthews. The Profile is the show where we sit down with a well-known Christian to hear more about their life, their faith and their ministry. It is brought to you in association with the UK's leading Christian magazine, Premier Christianity. The monthly title features more interviews just like this one, the latest news, reviews, columnists and more. To request a free sample copy of the latest issue, visit premierchristianity.com/free sample. Today on the show, I'm speaking to Taylor Schumann. Taylor is a survivor of a shooting in her college back in April 2013 in Christiansburg, Virginia, in the United States of America. With over 100 people dying from gun violence every day in the US, Taylor is forever grateful to God and is now a passionate advocate for gun control. Within our conversation, Taylor describes what happens to her on that day with descriptions of gun violence, which some listeners may find upsetting. Taylor began by casting her mind back to that time and sharing with me how life was for her back then.
Back in 2013, in the spring, my husband, we were engaged then. And so we were planning our wedding and planning a move to a new state. And I was working for a community college, helping out with their distance education program and their services for students who had disabilities. And I was just spending my days going to work and then planning a wedding and seeing friends and kind of doing all the things you do when you're, young and fresh out of college. And my husband was working just up the road from where I was. And everything was pretty normal and nice.
Yeah, and was faith important to you as a part of your life then?
It was. I had grown up always in church, and my relationship with God was always really important to me. And I would say that, although I had experienced some hard things in life, overall, like my life had been pretty easy. And so my relationship with God was sort of that He was a God in good times. And, I hadn't had much experience believing in God and talking to God through something really horrible and something really traumatic.
Which sadly is exactly what happened, isn't it, in 2013 when you were a social worker in a school in Virginia. Do you want to tell us about what you remember from that day and what happened?
Yeah, I was at work that day, and my coworker and I were getting ready to take our breaks. We each got a 15-minute break, and we decided she'd go first that day, and she went out to her car to eat. And I was sitting there and with my boss and another guy that was there helping us out with our computers. And I looked up in the middle of our conversation, and my boss kind of stood up, and her face had just gone white, and she started screaming. And I turned around, and there was a young man there sitting about 2 feet away from me, pointing a shotgun at me. And he had tried to shoot me from behind, but he was unable to get the safety off of the gun. And as my boss ran away, he ran after her, and that gave me time to kind of run back into a supply closet behind my desk. And as I shut the door, he fired through the door, and the bullet went through the door and then through my hand and kind of sent parts of that wood door flying. And so I had some shrapnel in my chest and my eye. I couldn't see out of one of my eyes for a while. And I couldn't lock the door because my keys were at my desk and the door locked from the outside, not from the inside. And I just felt really helpless, and I could kind of hear the gun going off around the school. And that was maybe one of the scariest parts, was that I was alone and I couldn't see anything. I could only hear what was happening. And I was in there for about 5 minutes, although it felt like much longer. I was sort of stunned to find out later that it had only been 5 minutes. And he came back at one point and tried to fire through the door again. And the bullet missed me just a couple inches. And there was one other girl, a student, that was wounded, and she also survived, thankfully. Um, and yeah, a off-duty security guard heard about it on the police scanner, and he actually drove to the school with his wife. They were out celebrating their anniversary that day, and they just drove over, and he came inside, and he was unarmed, and he was able to get the shooter to surrender his gun, and then he called out, and I knew that there was help there, and they helped me get outside, and that was kind of the beginning of the rest of the story.
Thank you so much for sharing with us, because I can imagine that is not easy to remember. It must be a story that you've told. I know you've written about it, but to retell it, to revisit it, it must trigger some of those emotions. Can you remember how you were pressing into God during that time of sheltering?
Yeah, it was one of those things where I realized as soon as it started happening that, oh, this is happening to me. I'm one of these people now. This will never have not happened to me. And I knew I should pray. And I couldn't, I had no words. I had no words in me. I was so afraid. I couldn't form any thoughts. And I that the scripture popped into my mind that when we don't know what to pray, the Spirit intercedes for us. And I felt like I was just experiencing that. I just knew God was with me. And even though I couldn't form any real prayers, that, the Spirit was interceding on my behalf. And at one point, I really thought I was going to die. I was losing a lot of blood, and I didn't know if anyone had called for help, and I didn't know how much time I had. And I was thinking of my fiance and my family, and never getting to do all the things that we'd wanted to do, and having to leave them. And it was like so physically painful, the emotional part. And I just prayed to God, if today is my day, if you're going to take me, please just take me quickly. This is just too terrible. Please just take me, take me. And I heard so clearly God speak to me in that moment that it wasn't my time. There was more for me to do. And from that moment, it kind of gave me a little resolve to try to think clearly and try to figure out what I could do to be safer. And I kind of got up, and I tried to stop the bleeding with my hand, and then I tried to kind of find a better place to hide. And it was about that moment that he shot through the door that second time. And, I really believe that it was God kind of giving me the strength to move away from where I was to spare me that bullet. And, in the days following, I look back, and I have never felt as close to God as I did that day and in the days after. Um, and so that part of the story is so tender to remember. Even though those memories are really hard to think about, I still remember like how close God was to me, and how that closeness that I felt to him, and that was sweet.
And what happened as you were rescued? How did you begin to rebuild your life and your confidence again? Because everything, as you said, everything must have shattered in that moment. You had become a statistic. You had become
Yeah.
like safety didn't have the same feeling about it, did it? Feeling safe anyway. How did you rebuild your life?
Well, thankfully, I have a really supportive family and friends. And my mom reached out to a friend, and they found a good counselor for me to go see. And I really didn't want to go. I didn't think I could talk about it yet. I really didn't see how I could do it, and I was really afraid to go. And to my mom's credit and my fiance, they just kind of put me in the car, and they're like, we're gonna go like to the counselor, and you don't have to talk if you don't want to, like, but let's just try to go. I was like, okay. And my counselor's name was Martha, and she was a believer and a very qualified counselor, and she helped me kind of become a person again and become Taylor again. And she really helped heal my heart. And we talked a lot about God and life and how things were different for me and what they could look like. And she was a safe space for me to kind of share the things that I didn't feel like I could share with my family or my friends. I just needed, someone that I wasn't going to worry or upset with what I needed to say. And yeah, she kind of helped me find my way back into the world. And I also began to see a clinical psychologist that specialized in post traumatic stress and had experience with other shooting survivors. And he really helped me kind of understand the science of trauma and what my body had gone through and how that would affect me. And that helped me understand myself and understand some of those triggers and what I could do and ways to kind of minimize the symptoms of PTSD in my life. And, obviously prayer and God was a huge part of that, helping me um, start to feel safe in places again. But yeah, it was quite disorienting to go from one day feeling very safe wherever I went for the most part to all of a sudden nowhere was safe. I didn't even want to leave the hospital there when they told me it was time to be discharged from the hospital to go home. I was really afraid because I was safe in the hospital and there were police there and going back out into the world seemed really scary.
And was there lasting damage to your hands where it had been shot? How did you recover physically?
Yeah, I was in physical therapy for about 1 year, and I had 4 surgeries to help me regain some mobility. And I had to work really hard. I went to those appointments about 3 times a week, and it was really painful and really exhausting. And, many days I did not want to go, but I had people to encourage me and to push me. And I knew that if I wanted to regain some use of my hand, I had to put in the work and I had to go through that pain. And that was really hard too, because, you get angry that someone else made this choice to harm you. And then you're the one continually having to kind of put yourself in pain to just get back a fraction of what you had. And so there was a lot of I think anyone who deals with an injury or chronic pain, there's such a large mental component. And so for me, those two things really played hand in hand because, if I was having a good day mentally and then my hand was hurting, that's a constant reminder of, oh, remember what happened to you? Like, so it's kind of hard to work through those things. But thankfully, I was able to regain about 20% use of my hand, which is only 20%, but it's a lot more than we thought in the beginning I would get back. And so some things are still really hard to do, but I've been able to kind of figure out ways to do things and to function and um, yeah.
And if I may ask, what has your journey of forgiveness been like for the person who did hurt you in this way? How hard has that been to forgive him?
Yeah, I think for a long time it was very much a daily act, um, you know, a having to forgive constantly in a way. Um, and for a while there, I could hardly think of it because it was so painful trying to figure out how I could uh, offer forgiveness to someone who'd done something terrible. And God was really gracious to help me understand that, the idea of forgiveness, it wasn't taking away consequences. It wasn't me saying, oh, I forgive him and he shouldn't have to, pay for what he did or experience a consequence. The forgiveness was really for me. Um, to be free from anger and bitterness and resentment. And God really helped me see the person that did this to me as a human being, as someone that God loved, as someone made in the image of God, and who experienced a different life than I did, and um, had pain and had mental health issues, and whatever you want to say about it. But once I began to see him as a human and not sort of an evil villain, it was much easier for me to offer forgiveness that um, I would I would want to receive. But yeah, I think in some days, I might feel pain, I might have a hard day, and I get angry all over again. And so I think it's okay for forgiveness to be sort of a continual journey in one's life, um, because I certainly experience that still.
And so tell me about your life now as we kind of move forward. What's your kind of heart and your mission now? Because and tell me about kind of the gun laws in America, because in the UK it's very, very different. Tell me about what you experienced there.
Yeah, so guns are much more prevalent, much more available here than they are there. They're easier to get than they are there. We have a national background check system that, um, since its start, it has stopped over 4 million gun sales to people who shouldn't have them. But there are a lot of sort of glaring loopholes in our system that make it easier for people who shouldn't have guns to get them. And beyond sort of the availability of guns here, the culture is really what drives um, sort of gun possession and gun culture. Here in America, we have the Second Amendment, which gives people the right to bear arms. And people take that really seriously, and they believe it was a God-given right that they should have access to the weapons that they want, whether it's for self-defense or collecting or a hunting hobby, whatever it is. And so when we talk here about gun reform, enacting new laws, new regulations, largely the battle is the people who want no laws or no regulation. And of course, here we have the National Rifle Association as well, which is a massive lobbying organization that spends millions of dollars to get our political leaders elected. And so, even when we have a nation of people who upwards of 90% support stronger gun laws, um, it's really hard to get those laws passed because there's a lot of money involved in politics here. Um, and so in America, we have 40,000 people that die every year from gun violence. It's about 100 people a day. Over 200 people are injured. 22 kids a day. Um, and we have the highest rates of gun violence of any developed country in the world. Um, and so, yeah, largely what we're battling here is sort of that culture and trying to figure out how to find common ground, and figure out how we can make our country safer.
And what's the battle that God has given you to fight? What are you hoping to achieve in sharing your story in the way that you are?
I think that when I first started sharing my story and sort of wading into the waters of talking about gun reform, what I realized was that although it's really prevalent here in America, most people don't know someone personally who has been shot or has lost someone to gun violence. And so when I started talking about my story, people are saying, I had no idea. I didn't know. This is so terrible. What happened to you? And from that point on, I was able to say, yes, this is horrible. And this is happening to a lot of people. And here's the problems with our laws. Here's what we could do better. And so a personal story really gives an access point to something you yourself haven't experienced, just like for me it does with, racism or immigrants, things that I cannot personally experience in that same way. And so, my first priority is to share my story and offer sort of a window into what this is like. And from then moving into teaching about of what we can do. And largely I talk to Christians, people of faith, and I think my biggest priority there is sort of asking people to consider whether they are considering their identity as an American first, or if they're considering their identity as a follower of God first, because we have different responsibilities um, and different goals depending on how we prioritize those roles. If we're considering ourselves as American first, any right given to us as an American will take precedent over maybe our obligation as Christians to love our neighbor and to consider their needs greater than our own, and to be uncomfortable for the sake of giving someone else comfort. And so if I can ask people to really thoughtfully consider that, um, and their opinions about guns, gun regulations, that to me is really what I hope to do through my book and my work.
And how has your relationship with God changed since 2013?
Yeah, I think, at the beginning of our conversation, I mentioned that for so long, like, the God I believed and knew was a God of good times, and I hadn't really had to rely on him for um, life, and he never had to be like the only thing that I had, and when I was shot, that changed, and I had to start getting to know, the God who is near to the brokenhearted and binds up our wounds and is with us in our physical suffering and when we feel like our body is failing us or betraying us. And God really helped me see my experience as a way to connect with other people who are marginalized and are hurting, and see him as a God over suffering, and that even in suffering, he is still good. Um, and one of the greatest lessons I really had to learn is that I'm someone who doesn't like to ask for help. I do not like to be an inconvenience to people or feel like a burden. And after this happened, not only did I have to ask other people for help, but I had to ask the Lord for help. And he was so kind to show me that I'm not a burden to him. I'm not inconveniencing him with my needs or my prayers, um, that he loves to be with me and loves to take care of me. Um, and that has been life changing for me in my walk with God, and then how I love other people and how I, hope to help other people too.
And you're a mom now. So tell me, how does
Mhm.
it feel thinking about your own children going to school? Does that bring up some fears for you, or have you been able to put them to rest at the foot of the cross? Have you given those fears to God fully now?
I think it can be a daily act of surrender. My son is 2.5, so he's not quite in school yet, but he does go to a church nearby for a few hours of childcare a couple days a week. And when I first started taking him, I it was a little easier because it was a church. It didn't feel like school. But, some days I'll drop him off and then maybe I hear sirens somewhere in the city. And it sort of reminds me that I am not in control over this. Um, I think that it will continue to be like that for me, and God will meet me there and give us comfort. It's a hard thing with my husband too, because he was in school for a lot of the time the first few years of our marriage, and he now works in a hospital, and sometimes in dangerous situations. And so for a long time, I was terrified when he would walk out the door to go to school or to work. Um, and so I've really had to learn to rely on God, that he is, the giver of our safety, and that even when the worst things happen, he is still there. Um, but, it also drives me to do what I do. I have this little boy who right now his world is perfect and not scary, and he doesn't know. Um, about the awful things that have happened to his mom, and to the people around him. And I, I sort of have this image in my mind of, years from now, where he's saying to me, Mom, why hasn't anyone done anything about gun violence here? And I just do not want that to ever happen. I never want to have to look him in the eye and say, well, we just thought it was too hard, or, it was just a lost cause. Um, I want his world to be better. I want the world to be better for his kids, and all the other kids around us. Someone has to be the adult, and we need to do what we can to make the world better for our kids. And yeah, that's why I do it.
That was Taylor Schumann speaking to me, Rachel Matthews, here on Premier Christian Radio. We hope you enjoyed this interview.
These days, you can't get a lot for your pound. You could get a pack of balloons, a DIY face mask, or some plasters. Ouch! Or £1 could get you great reporting, brilliant interviews, and loads of Christian news articles, all in Premier Christianity. In print, online, and on the app, for just £1 a month in the summer sale limited offer. Get yours at premierchristianity.com. The Profile. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio.
Well, hello and welcome to the second part of today's edition of The Profile with me, Justin Brierley. And my guest for this section of the programme is Mark Vernon. He's going to tell us about who he is, but he is currently the author of a very recent book, Dante's Divine Comedy, a guide for the spiritual journey. It's 700 years since Dante died, and we're going to be finding out from Mark who he was, what impact his writings had, and what it can say to us today, 700 years later. Mark, welcome along. Great to have you with me.
Thank you. It's nice to talk about these things.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, consider me an uninitiated Philistine, all right, when it comes to Dante. So you're very much starting from the beginning. Tell us, first of all, who Dante was, what, his body of work was about, and particularly the impact that the Divine Comedy has had culturally and historically.
So he lives, as you say, 700 years ago in the 13th century, dying then. And I mean, one way of thinking about why that is significant is because it's sometimes called the first industrial revolution now. He lived at the time when things like mercantilism, trading, was beginning to take a form that matters to us now. So the precursors to capitalism, society was changing. In terms of how human beings think about themselves, you might say, it's the earliest days of the Renaissance. So, for example, he's a friend of Giotto, and Giotto paints these human figures that have an inner life that feels a bit like our inner life when we look at them. So he comes at this really seminal moment in terms of the emergence of what we now call modernity, and writes this great epic, the Divine Comedy, in the last part of his life when he himself was in exile. The Italian peninsula was a whole series of city-states, often at war with each other. And Florence, his hometown, fell into civil war around the 1300s. And that led to him being sent into exile. It seemed like a complete disaster for his life. He was already well known, both as a poet and as a politician. But it's out of this catastrophe that over the next 20 or so years before he dies in 1321, the Divine Comedy is born. And hence the famous opening line midway through the journey of our life. He actually says our life. He wants to draw us straight in. He wakes up and finds himself in a dark wood. And that launches what's not just the kind of midlife crisis and how he recovers, but a complete transformation of his perception of himself, his times, and God.
So give us a sense of what the book actually is for those who have not read it, as I'm sure many listeners won't have had a chance to read it. What actually is the story that gets woven in the Divine Comedy?
It is one of these books which everyone's heard of, and you've undoubtedly come across references to it too, particularly the first part, the Inferno. He journeys through hell, right down to the floor of hell, stands right in front of Lucifer, and then begins to find a way out, first of all through Mount Purgatory, which is a process of change where his sight and perception expands, and then into paradise, where ultimately he stands before God face to face. And so it's this journey right across the cosmos, as particularly the medieval imagination understood it. But he's very much writing, I think, for the future, for our times as well. And he senses that the modern period, it's not just anachronistic to talk about modernity, because he actually is the first person to use the word modern. So he's sensing times are changing, and feels that we need to re-establish how we connect to divine reality if things aren't to go very, very wrong. So it's not just his personal crisis, but the crisis of his times, and I think still ours, which is why it still speaks to people now. But it is quite a labyrinth. I mean, my book, in a way, is to try and say, look, if you want to get into this thing that you've heard of, and you maybe even have heard that it's one of the, I'd put it in the top 3 bits of genius Western Christian literature, you know, after the Bible, as it were. So if you're serious about Christianity, it felt like this to me, you know, it's kind of like a bit of a mountain that I've got to try and climb. I hope my book helps people find a way into it. But it's so important, because it's not just, you know, of interest. It really does change you when you embark and engage with it, which is another reason why it's difficult. It's not just complicated because there's lots of characters in it and so on. It's difficult because it's asking you to change if you're going to try and keep up with what's being conveyed. You know, it's one of these works which you could say is inspired in that sense. It channels so much more than itself.
So would the average reader be able to sort of literally pick it up and sort of understand it, or is it the kind of thing where you really do need a guidebook really to understand what someone from 700 years ago is trying to convey through this specific type of literature?
I think it does help to have a guide. I mean, you know, Dante famously himself has a guide. He's met by Virgil in the dark wood, and then eventually is met by Beatrice as they go into paradise. So there's no shame in having a guide. I mean, it's very much part of grace, actually, to have a guide. You know, these things are always meaningful. Any good modern translation, I mean, if people want to read a specific recommendation, I recommend the one that's in the Penguin Classics in English, translated by Mark Muser. And it has a good number of notes, so that you can, as it were, read a section and then look at the notes, and he explains any characters, gives you some sense of what's going on, and then you can start to let the text speak to you more and more. So I do pick up some sort of guide. And
before we come to your own guide, which obviously I wanted to talk about, this particular book you've written, A Guide for the Spiritual Journey, how would you say what Dante has written has sort of made sense of your own journey? Because I know you've been on a significant kind of trajectory, different things. You've had your own sort of crises of faith in the past. You've described yourself as an agnostic at various points, Mark, and then sort of come back to something which you think does connect you with the fundamental kind of truth of Christianity and so on. To what extent has Dante been part of that journey that you've gone on yourself?
Very much part of it. I, you know, a bit like perhaps many people, I kind of wanted to read it, tried to read it, half read it, but then it was actually the thing that really brought it to life for me, in that mix of my own particular journeys you described, was my own psychotherapy. Actually, I went into psychotherapy to try to understand more about what was more frightening me and, you know, perhaps blocking life for me and so on. And I then began to understand how the descent, which Dante literally undertakes into these dark infernal regions through the famous circles of hell, is about encountering, well, your own darkness too, and how that can become very preoccupying and can keep you stuck, and quite literally blocks out sight of wider reality. But by, I mean, you know, a Christian idiom here would be something like taking up your own cross. You know, there's a strange, wonderful thing, but thing you feel very cautious about saying too, because it's a serious undertaking, that our suffering actually is often the way that we find the path to light. It's not that you kind of sidestep it or it just dissolves or it goes away. Following the way of the cross, going on the descent is the precursor to the ascent. And so he gave me kind of courage, if you like, that this darkness that I felt I was facing, this confusion, wasn't all a sort of big mistake that somehow I had to get over, but didn't know how. It was actually the path. It was actually the route. And then seeing how he conveys it helped me to work out what that might mean for me now. So it was very much part of the kind of the turnaround for me over time. This all takes a bit of time, but it was very much part of that turnaround for me.
So coming to you, this guide that you've written for the book, has it been a long time in the making? Did you sort of, and obviously I suppose intentionally you were wanting to bring it out in time for this special anniversary as well?
Yeah, it sort of evolved. So I started off, I wanted to read the book again. It's one of these books you read many times when you've got into it. And I thought this time I'll do some podcasts on it. And so I started doing that through the lockdown, actually, the early parts of the lockdown. And then, they had a bit of traction. And then someone said to me, surely this is a book in the making. And so eventually it became a book. Each canto, there's 100 cantos across the 3 parts of the poem. And so each canto has a chapter that's both a narrative retelling of what's going on, but also explanation and my interpretation, because I've wanted also to focus very much on the spiritual transformation. It felt to me quite likely that the 700th anniversary is going to be celebrated in terms of Dante as a historical figure, a literary figure, but perhaps not as a religious figure. And yet he tells us many times that he felt charged by heaven to guide people in the way that he had gone. So I didn't want me to feel like the 700th anniversary was going to pass and that the religious element was going to be kind of written out. The Christian element was going to be written out. So my book very much focuses on that and what's going on there.
And so who is the kind of person who might benefit, you think, from picking up this book, whether or not they've heard of Dante or read the Divine Comedy? Where do you expect this to be someone who perhaps is feeling like a kind of disconnect with the world, with God, not sure where they find their place in it, that you believe the Divine Comedy could be a help in them guiding that kind of a person?
Yeah, it's a book that takes you into the subtleties of life and shows you how that's where the limitless lies. You can, as it were, go through life almost as if it's a kind of flat land. And it can be, pleasant enough, has its ups and downs. But, maybe every so often you wonder what an artist sees that perhaps you don't feel you quite see. Or, conversely, in more religious writing, I don't know, you might read someone like William Blake saying that when he looks at the sun, he just doesn't just see a guinea shining in the sky like a coin. He sees the heavenly hosts crying, holy, holy, holy. And you think, well, what are they on about? And Dante's book, I think, opens up reality in that way. It's in poetry, and so metaphor and image. He sparks your own desire. He makes you want more from life, and that is what leads to you being open to receiving more. So it's certainly for the Christian who wants to take their life in more expansive directions. But I think because his focus is so much on perception, it's about anyone also too who wants to know more about the inside of the whole world, not just their own inside too. And so, it's why it's inspired all sorts of people, actually, whether they're religious or not. They feel it's saying there's more, there's more, there's more. And here's how to find out about that.
Your own book obviously is split into the 3 parts that mirror Dante's journey: the Inferno, firstly, the Purgatorio, and the Paradiso. Just give us an explanation of what these 3 stages are and what lessons you've tried to draw out for the reader of your own guide to the Divine Comedy.
Yeah, so he takes this threefold understanding of reality, as was widespread in the medieval world, in the Islamic world as well as Christian. Actually, it's quite likely that he's quite inspired by Muslim traditions too. But it's not in any sense a literal account of the afterlife. You very quickly you realize that he's taking you into, you might even say nowadays, states of mind as much as parts of reality. But you also start to realize that those two things are much closer than you previously thought, perhaps. And so that as your mind itself changes, so more of reality opens up to you. And broadly speaking, in the Inferno, he meets individuals who have got stuck in life. They often feel they've been condemned by a judging God, but Dante increasingly realizes that they've got stuck in the past, and so their lives are kind of on repeat. They've done things that they feel vengeful about or shamed about, and they can't break free of them, and that keeps them sort of stuck in these hellish states of mind. And and that spoke very powerfully to me as a psychotherapist, again, because I knew myself, and I certainly have worked with people that can feel completely stuck, like life can't change. When he gets into purgatory, again, using the old Christian understanding of a place where we change, so we become more and more capable of divine life. He realizes that he's being purged, not of his bad stuff, not of his sin, but of that which blocks him. And so it's the place where change starts to really happen for him. And whilst there's suffering in purgatory, because you have to look at yourself primarily, it's a place of hope too. There's always, the sun is, or the stars are always in the sky. So you're always being led forward. It's worth undertaking this difficult journey. And then in the paradise, in a way, the problems cease. He knows he's got what it takes, and he's receiving from God what's needed, but there's still a whole expanse to discover. And so the journey doesn't stop there. It's one of the lovely things, actually. It's not like you've arrived. It's like, okay, now you're going to see the beauty of God. The question is how, and that then becomes the journey itself.
Now, as you can probably tell, I haven't read The Divine Comedy, but I have read C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce. And just your description there, it sounds like, Lewis, for one, would have borrowed a great deal from the imagery and the way in The Great Divorce he imagines this kind of scenario of people going to a kind of limbo state or heavenly place and sort of meeting people along the way who have got stuck, as you described, and how they can, and the things that limit them from accessing the divine life and so on. So I imagine in that sense, Dante has inspired countless probably people in terms of, other sorts of progress journeys, whether it be Pilgrim's Progress or The Great Divorce or whatever. Could you speak to some of those examples?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's direct. C.S. Lewis was one of the greatest scholars of English medieval literature in the 20th century, and was a scholar and studied Dante too, as part of that. And he undoubtedly deeply inspired him to try and write about the afterlife in these kind of narrative ways, because the point is, if you try and do it literally, it just kind of becomes clunky, because in a way, entering the afterlife is about your transformation. And so it has to act on you. You have to react to it. And so books like The Great Divorce are very much trying to do that. And if you read it, you've been reading a fiction, and yet you feel something has expanded tremendously inside you as a result of reading it. And Lewis was right onto that. Perhaps the best known example of him writing in parallel to the Divine Comedy now, since the work of Michael Ward in his book Planet Narnia, has been how the 7 books of the Narnia stories match the parts of the paradise in the Divine Comedy. Dante enters through various sort of parts of heaven, if you like, and each part has a certain kind of quality. And as he becomes more familiar with that quality, so the heavens open up that bit more. And the case has been made that Dante was wanting in the Narnia stories for us to get a different feel for parts of life in the different stories, so that our sense of reality opens up as well. I think, Lewis very much bought into Dante's argument that the modern world was in a kind of spiritual crisis, and that we needed to use all the powers of our imagination as well as analysis to try and reconnect us to this crucial fundamental aspect of reality.
As you say, they're both in that sense trying to kind of engage with the reality that in a sense you have to describe in analogies and pictures and metaphorical language in that way. Yet at the same time, very often when I've run into people talking about Dante, they speak as though, oh, he's the one who mapped out the 7 circles of hell or whatever, as though he was giving some very physical, specific reality to the afterlife. So have we just misunderstood that? Is that just a kind of common, misunderstanding of Dante and what he was doing?
I think he certainly begins where he imagined a lot of his readers would be at. And so the Inferno looks a bit like Hell 101 to start with. But he's just sort of trying to connect with you where you might be at, and immediately starts to unravel these assumptions, and not to just to undermine what you think, but because, as with all sorts of religious truths and religious texts, there is a kind of surface reading which you need to kind of get going, but then you read it again and something else opens up, and you read it again and something else opens up, and before you know what's happened, you're seeing subtleties which were just not available to you before. And so the old literal readings, you sort of give thanks for them because they got you going, but you realize there's so much more than just that. I mean, he's quite explicit about this. I mean, one of his other bits of writing that survives was a letter to one of his patrons, and he explains quite straightforwardly that, look, there's a literal reading of this, but don't stop there. There's allegory, a sort of moral take on things, but then there's what he calls a tropological stage, when you're really wrestling with what's going on here, what's this really about. It feels as bewildering as it does inviting. And then you get to what he calls the anagogic, which is a perspective more from the divine point of view. And so you feel your own sight aligning amazingly. Again, it's one of these things you hardly dare say, but with the divine sight. But he's quite clear that's what he's inviting us. That's what he thinks the Christian journey is about. This is not just about securing a place in the afterlife. This is about sharing divine life here and hereafter.
And how was it received at the time? Did people appreciate it? Was he considered a bit, out there? What was the reception?
It was wildly successful, actually, right from the word go. It's one of those bits of medieval literature for which I think even hundreds of manuscripts from the earliest days survive. So scholars now, conclude that it was copied many, many times. It's circulated very widely. There were calls for public readings of it from pretty early on as well. There were some church figures that reacted nervously to it. Even one or two tried to get it banned. He's famously, hugely critical of the church. And remember, he lives at the time as well of the Franciscan movements and the Beguine movements, these kind of grassroots uprisings within medieval Christendom, which the official church felt very uneasy about, and for very good reason. So he's part of that upswelling of popular Christianity. I mean, he writes in Italian, rather than Latin, the vernacular, precisely to reach more and more people. Again, part of that movement where the Bible starts getting translated into the vernacular as well. So he very definitely wanted it to reach all sorts of people, and part of the reason why he uses imagery is so that it sticks in your mind, and you can return to it and get more and more out of it. Yeah,
I mean, we live in a day today where obviously the Enlightenment and the sort of the progress of science, the success of science, really has caused a lot of people to kind of simply approach the world in naturalistic terms and say, this is what we have, and as long as we can control our chemistry and biology, we'll make the best of life and so on. But that still seems to leave a lot of people cold. They feel like, no, there's more, that's sort of dealing with a sort of shallow level at which life is lived. And so you've got the rise of, even in the secular circles, I think a lot of people asking spiritual questions again. goes without saying, people like Jordan Peterson and so on, who've been at the forefront of this, but many others, and I come across them all the time. People who aren't satisfied, I suppose, with just jumping wholesale into a kind of specific religious worldview, but they're unhappy with the secular worldview at the same time. I mean, do you feel like Dante is maybe a bridge for someone like that, who's at that kind of a point in their life?
I hope so. I mean, I really do. And maybe what it does is it makes you realize that knowledge and truth isn't just objective, as if it can be sort of written on a page in a scientific or quasi-scientific way and made to kind of stack up. But actually, we know something's true when it resonates with us, when we participate in our hearts as much as in our minds with its truth. And so that's why imagination, it's why story, it's why experience is actually the primary source of truth. And Dante puts that absolutely in front of you and says, look, I did the same when I woke up in this dark wood, thought my life was in a complete mess, and it was. And yet it led me all this way. So I think that people like Peterson and others are realizing that earlier kind of new atheistic phase was just too literal when it comes to knowledge and truth. And it just feels a bit empty and even a bit noddy now. They want more, and they know that life has got a kind of felt richness as well as an analytical richness, that reason and intelligence are about what you can absorb as much as what you can sort of pod and poke. Perception, again, is such light, and he gets drawn to the light all the time, and what you can see is as much how you interpret what you see as much as just sort of putting it into a test tube and measuring it. Yeah, so this whole area of participation and truth is really opening up now, and figures in the public that people get drawn to. They sense it. That's why they watch all these blogs and YouTubes and things.
Well, thank you for producing this book. As I say, the 700th anniversary, I think, has literally just passed. I think it's around the 13th or 14th of September that marks the 700th anniversary of Dante's death. What sort of things are you seeing kind of come out to sort of mark this special occasion, apart from obviously the publication of your own very fine book, Mark?
Well, there's in Italy particularly, there's huge celebrations. Dante is the Italian Shakespeare. I mean, another part of his legacy was that he really makes modern Italian. There have been a whole bunch of different dialects around Italy before Dante, but he kind of brings it all together in his aftermath. And so he's absolutely seminal figure in Italy. But even in other parts of the world, there's kind of fans like me giving talks, and there's an exhibition, I know, at the Dante Society in London, for example. And I think that, with luck, perhaps because of this particular moment we find ourselves in, where we realize that these figures that came at the beginning of the modern period have got something which we can now revisit and make our own, because we sense that so much of what life is offering feels like it's emptied out a bit. And so returning to the kind of wellspring of our own times, if you like, which he lived in, it has great appeal, I hope and think.
Yeah, I heard someone say the other day, if you're reading more people who are alive than who are dead, then you need to change your reading list up. We need to get back to people like Dante, who, 700 years on, we're still talking about what he wrote and the way it's impacted culture. But thank you so much. Dante's Divine Comedy, A Guide for the Spiritual Journey, is the book to go and check out. Mark Vernon is the author, and I'll make sure there's a link from today's show as well. But thanks for being my guest today, Mark.
Thank you very much. It's a delight to talk about.
Thanks for being with us here on The Profile with me, Justin Brierley. Do make sure to check in again at the same time next week, when we'll be talking to more Christians in all walks of faith and life. And do make sure to check out our sister magazine, Premier Christianity, where you can find a free sample copy at their website, premierchristianity.com/free sample. See you next time.